To a look into the confusing legal jumble that is the fair use policy. Fair use was designed to sidestep strict copyright protection laws so that educators didn't face stiff fines and other kinds of trouble for using copyrighted work. Thankfully, and more importantly, legally, there is a way around the stringent laws of copyright, but nobody seems clear on just what the loopholes entail. Today we are going to look into fair use and copyright and try to unravel some of the mysteries surrounding it. Copyright is a section of intellectual property law and protects original works of authorship, including literary, musical, and artistic works. Although similar in idea, copyright is different from patents and trademarks because a patent protects inventions or discoveries, and a trademark protects words, phrases, or symbols or designs identifying a source of goods and services. In general, copyright registration is completely voluntary. Copyrights exist from the moment the work is created. Many choose to register their works because they want to have the facts of their copyright on public record. Services exist that will copyright something for you, but usually at a nominal fee. I found Copyright.com, who offers to register your work for free. In 2001, AM Records brought a company called Napster to court on the grounds that through the use of their online program, they were distributing copyrighted material and encouraging others to do so. Napster claimed something called fair use in its defense, but the courts did not agree, to the tune of a settlement of $26 million and ultimately shutting Napster down. Fair use came up again in the trial of a photocopying service that was using copyrighted university materials to make and sell student packs. The courts ruled that it was not fair use. In 1991, copy center Kinko's was the defendant in a fair use case. In this case, a major publishing house alleged that Kinko's infringed on their copyrights when they copied excerpts from books whose rights were held by the plaintiff. The court agreed with the plaintiff, and Kinko's was found in violation of copyright law. With all these infringement court cases, it's no wonder a person might think twice about using copyrighted material. But as teachers, we use anything and everything we can if it'll help with our lesson plans. We need it because most of us want to provide a richer, more in-depth experience for our students. So what is a well-meaning putting kids first teacher to do? Enter the fair use policy. Officially, the government explains that you should always try to contact the copyright holder and obtain the copyright permission. But we're talking about teachers here looking for something to enrich their lessons, and most teachers don't have the resources, or let's face it, the time, to obtain in writing every permission necessary to cover all the materials they borrow. Fair use first emerged in the decision of the Folsom v. Marsh trial back in 1841. In that case, the defendant stood accused of copying the plaintiff's book about George Washington in order to produce a separate book of his own. The courts looked into it, and they ruled in favor of the plaintiff, but in doing so set into motion the idea of fair use. On November 11th in 2008, a list of 5 principles regarding best practices for fair use in education came out. Best practice guidelines are important because they help correctly educate teachers about vague topics such as fair use and provide consistency that is harder to fight in a courtroom. Under the 5 principles, educators could now make copies of newspaper articles, TV shows, or other copyrighted works and use them for any educational purpose, or create curriculum materials using copyrighted materials, share, sell, and distribute those curriculum materials, and use copyrighted works in the process of creating new materials. And they could even distribute their works digitally if they meet something called transformative standards. A transformative work is something new made out of something existing. Creating a new work falls under its own copyright protection as a tangible, therefore copyrighted work. The key is to remember that the amount of borrowing is directly related to the lesson requirements. Columbia University asks its teachers and students to consider guidelines when questioning fair use. Guidelines like the purpose and character of the use, or is the use of the copyrighted work for non-profit or educational purposes. To be considered safe under the fair use blanket, one must consider the effect of the potential market for the copyrighted work. Downloading a movie and showing it in your home could in some ways impact the movie as a sellable commodity, but showing Glory to your history class, however, will probably not, as it is for an educational reason. The use of copyrighted works for nonprofit and educational purposes is more likely to be considered under the fair use blanket. Teachers and instructors have even more specific rules that can be applied to source material in an effort to avoid the misconceptions as to the legality of fair use. Copying by instructors must meet tests for brevity. In other words, if you use something repeatedly, it is less likely to be considered fair use. Using something over a period of multiple semesters or years is really not within the spirit of the fair use exception. Some examples of using materials in a manner that could be considered a violation of fair use includes things like making multiple copies of a different work that could substitute for purchasing, such as in the case of a book, or copying and using the same work from semester to semester. Now that we talked about some things to consider when considering fair use, we should look at some examples of common copyrighted material that, if used correctly, should fall into the fair use category. A chapter from a book, an article from a periodical or newspaper, poetry, prose, or illustrations. But please remember, you should only use these items for non-commercial purposes. The notion of fair use seems to be in the best interests of the teacher, with guidelines that ask you to use common sense and a moral compass to make decisions. But because the laws aren't specific, and many of them border on suggestions, the best thing to do is to adhere to the same professionalism in regards to fair use as you hopefully adhere to in your general teaching practice. Sometimes we tend to vilify copyright holders. But, after all, copyright holders are entitled to protect what belongs to them. Many of them would have no other protection without copyright laws to keep people from affecting their livelihoods. The key to fair use is to be aware of your intended application of the material in question and not to overdo the amount that you borrow.